Total War Warhammer 2's campaign is centered around the Great Vortex, a swirling hurricane of magic in the heart of Ulthuan. It's created by Kalidor Dragon Tamer, and it serves as a means of drawing and drastically reducing the winds of magic in the Warhammer world. But what is it really, though, right? Why did this even happen? What events come about that would cause this massive vortex of magic? So today we're going to talk about the Great Catastrophe, and that is something that Creative Assembly has talked about, and we know from the intro of every single race in Total War Warhammer 2 as the reason for the Great Vortex. This is a series of events that leads to the downfall of the Old Ones and the rise of the Elves and the Dwarfs, and really the successful preservation of the world we currently play in. So that's going to be this video here today. So let's kind of set the scene for everything, kind of where it all kind of began. So we know that the Old Ones were the starfaring race that created the Lizardmen. And these are the same Old Ones that we see in the 40k universe, these kind of omnipotent lizards, lizard people, I guess, that get involved in this huge war, the War of the Heavens. And it's between the Old Ones and the Catan, who actually ally with the Necrons. And so the Old Ones then create the Eldar race, they create the Korks, or Kroak, or whatever, the basically proto-orcs. And in Warhammer, they create, as we've said, the Lizardmen in their image. And they're the first, and they start the first spawning of the Slann. And these Slann, as we know, they assist them in creating the geomantic web, separating the continents, because there was one kind of giant Warhammer Pangea at one point, the Saurus, the Skink, and Crocosaur species as well. So from there, the Old Ones create the Elves, who they taught magic to in the same way as they taught the Slann. And then shortly after that, they create the Dwarfs. And the Dwarfs were created kind of contrary to the Elves. The whole point of the Dwarfs was to be, okay, if the Elves are too emotional, that's kind of a thing, and too magic prone, the Dwarfs are the kind of not the antithesis, but they're more honor bound. They're not as likely to get flagrant with their emotions and start sliding with a Slaanesh or something like that. So the Dwarfs are created who, rather than being able to control magic, can imbue magic rather than, of course, wielding it. So they take part in runesmithing. So lastly, though, they create man, and man kind of acts as a middle ground between the three. Not as corruptible as the Elves, quote unquote, but not as magic illiterate as the Dwarfs. And when I say illiterate, I just mean the capability to wield magic in the conventional way. And towards the end, though, in haste, the Old Ones create the halflings and the ogres. And it's funny because the ogres were, and I've said this before, were supposed to be the ultimate answer to chaos. But they couldn't really finish what they were doing, hence why ogres are all typically some variation of inept. And it's worth noting that the Old Ones did create the orcs, as we've said, but not in this world. It's kind of assumed that they came from the Korks that they created on other planet. They're basically massive fungi that spawn. But initially, that's neither here nor there. So let's kind of get into the initial phases of what creates the Great Catastrophe. And the first big act of the Great Catastrophe is the catastrophe itself, and that's the Old Ones' polar gates. And these are the polar gates that they use to basically travel. They use this to dip in and out of the warp, but these polar gates collapse, and this results in a massive implosion that opens chaos gates at both the North and South poles. And this brings about a whole mess of bad news. Warpstone meteors, worldwide mutations as a result of the warpstone dust from the warpstone meteors, the coming of Morslieb, which is the moon, a giant hunk of warpstone, and that's what really acts as the moon for the Warhammer world. That's just really to name a few. But obviously one of the most important things to happen is the unending flow of chaos who come hurtling out of the gates, and they set to really kind of devour all the souls on this plane. They go to completely destroy it, as that's kind of what demons of chaos do. But this is when we get beastmen. They're mutated by the warpstone for each creature that attains. So Ratman, they come about as well, or Skaven, as we now know, but they're born from the swamplands north of Tilia, soon to be Skaven Blight. But we also get hippogriffs, chimeras, manticores, and griffins as a result of this rampant mutation from the warpstone dust. So I guess not everything is bad. I mean, Eltharion wouldn't have his faithful griffin mouth if it wasn't for this. But the Old Ones sort of disappear, right? They vanish this time. They leave the kind of races of the world to fend for themselves. They just kind of disappear. Nothing really. It's kind of assumed that they left the Warhammer world to go fight the War of the Heavens, and they just couldn't focus on it anymore. So they just kind of left it to its own devices with the intention of coming back. So this is where the Slann kind of rose to the occasion and sealed much of the giant gateways to the Immaterium. And in doing so, this kind of killed off over half of the Slann, and it melts their brains. It talks about how it just kind of makes them go insane from the huge influx of magical energy. And this is really a realm that they don't really know much about. Like, their Old One Masters, they know tons about it. As a quick aside, actually, on that, at this time, there were far more winds of magic in the world, period. And the magnitude and strength of spells was 10 times what it is now. So, I mean, even as a further aside to that, the Old Ones used the Immaterium to travel, seamlessly at first, but eventually when the sentient races are created, their emotions cause fluctuations in the warp. It causes kind of nascent warp entities to come about. That's what creates the Chaos Gods, are the emotions of sentient beings such like humans and such. And it talks about in the 40k lore how the Old Ones used to kind of push through the warp in almost as a gentle rolling current. And then after that, it kind of got a little more tumultuous. And they're the ones that create the webway. I mean, the Old Ones are vastly important to both worlds' history. A little bit less in the Warhammer world because they kind of touch on it and then leave. But in the 40k history, the Eldar flourish because of the webway that the Old Ones created, they used to move. And then the webway becomes this whole point of contention between Space Marines and Eldar. But huge digression there. But the problem was that the Slann didn't close the gateways entirely, but they did help to stem the kind of tide of demons coming in. And the issue is that you have a near limitless and cunning foe against these kind of fledgling races. Lizardmen have just sprouted out in the past 1,000 years, and then elves and dwarves and men shortly after that. They're not very developed. And the Lizardmen were primarily guided by the Old Ones. They weren't used to kind of calling the shots themselves. So as chaos kind of scours the world, they brought many primitive tribes of men into their fold, and this is where you get the beginning of the Warriors of Chaos as a whole, imbuing them with their kind of fell powers. And you're going to hear from this video where a lot of the races come to be. We've already talked about how Beastmen and Skaven have come out of this, how High Elves, Dwarfs, or Elves in general, I guess, and men have come about, how Lizardmen have come about. We now know how Warriors of Chaos, and we will continue to hear more and more. We know about the Ogres too as well. But this is what starts really the first Chaos War, the first Chaos incursion. And what happens now starts that kind of war with these next couple events. So with the Warriors of Chaos marching with their, cloven and bestial demons of chaos, the Pantheon kind of took to the terrestrial plane as they burned their way through the world. And the Lizardmen faced the brunt of the Chaos incursion, them being the most developed race at the time, and the oldest and largest of the races. So the Saurus were easily kind of able to go toe-to-toe with the demons. They're these big, hulking lizard, raptor, hybrid dinosaur creatures, but they're able to match the kind of ferocity of these demons. And the Slann were able to harness all these rampant winds of magic cascading around the world to deliver these massive amounts of destruction upon our hooved friends. But the winds of magic, are fickle. That's important to note as we kind of go forward here. But like I was saying, there's so much winds of magic being outpoured from these gates that the Slann can command an amazing amount of destruction with this. And despite all this, though, the demons were, to use a cliche, legion, and really had no end in sight. So with each victory came another defeat that was more and more crippling than the last. And the Slann eventually started losing control of the extreme winds of magic. As we said, they're very fickle. And this causes these epic kind of miscasts that would result in these mental backlashes, the blowing their little froggy brains apart. I'm sure that's the noise it would make. The winds of magic, though, are really a part of the Immaterium. They're not a subject of the Warhammer world, like, oh, I'm sitting on a plane and I feel the wind of the wind, and I feel the wind of the magic. No, it's directly coming from the warp. And the demons obviously have a mastery of it that the Slann just can't match. So the Slann were pulling out all the stops here. They began changing the landscape itself to serve the Lizardmen and really impede the demons, and they retreat back to their temple cities, and all of Lustria was overridden by a deadly, vicious jungle with carnivorous plants and wildlife. If from the tabletop version of the game, Lizardmen have access to jungle swarms, which we don't get in this, and a lot more actual. Like we get the basilisks in the Lizardmen roster, a lot more actual beasts and more dinosaurs in the Lizardmen roster, and you kind of see that coming out here. Like they directly create and control this vicious jungle, more or less, and this slows down the demons' pretty much endless march considerably. You know, this jungle is basically a living trap for them, and the Lizardmen employ ancient engines and devices left over by the old ones, and that kind of makes it sound like, because in the book literally says that it kills by the thousands, so it makes me think that maybe like some sort of plasma technology was left behind, or something like a las, like not quite literally a las cannon, because that's kind of from the Imperium, but still something like that, some sort of destructive device that allows them to kill demons in huge swaths. So the Slann even went one step further than all this and set up a series of wards that were powered by the geometric web, you know, connected from each temple city. So this allows them to really hold back the tide, because each demon has to crash against these wards before they can even get in, and the wards for the most part will kill them. So eventually, you know, demons being demons, were able to breach the wards of Zahutek and destroying the temple city, which led to the weakening of the wards at Huatl, Laxlaw, and Zotl, who all really fell shortly after, you know, them being all connected by this geometric web, by this series of wards. So more cities fell after that, you know, Chaqua, Wazodek, Zarmuda, each one with newer and more cunning ways the demons had devised. You know, only a handful of cities were left, and these ones were defended by the most ancient and strongest of the Slann. And it's important to note that when I say more cunning ways, you know, you've got plagues infesting these cities, you've got Nurglings, or I'm sorry, like Tzeentch using all sorts of manner of change to affect these cities. Like, all sorts of the crazy ways that chaos likes to do their due. But from here, this kind of stems things sort of kind of have separate offshoots, falling into the three major races, you know, the Lizardmen, the Elves, and Dwarves. So we'll go into what happens with each, but first let's just kind of finish the story of the Lizardmen, then we'll jump into the Dwarves, and we'll conclude it with the Elves, because the Elves just save the day. God, they're so cool. Who wouldn't want to be an elf? But the demons eventually make it to Itza. We know Itza from Total War Warhammer 2, and this is called the First City, and really the center of the geometric web under the Lizardmen. And this is where we find Lord Kroak. And Lord Kroak, from the tabletop, if you know, he's the very first and strongest of the Slann of them all. You know, remember, there were multiple spawnings of Slann, and each one was weaker than the last. I think there's a total of 4. And the demons were literally vaporized by the ward that Kroak put up, because that's how strong he was. But we're talking about centuries of conflict here. This isn't just something that happens over 10, 15, 20 years. These are hundreds of years of fighting. The Great Catastrophe is, again, centuries long. It's not just a simple undertaking here. So as time kind of passes, the demons hurl themselves at the bubble, more or less, time and time again, against to weaken. And rather than let the shield fall, though, Kroak explodes it outward, right? And he tries to take as many demons with him, and it talks about how it kills hundreds of thousands of demons. And a final conflict sort of ensues as the Temple Guard of Lord Kroak, hold off a near limitless horde of demons on, it's really just an anticlimactic name, but the Bridge of the Stars. And this gives Kroak enough time to work his final spell, as it were, you know, his final flash, like Vegeta in Dragon Ball Z. But the Temple Guard were slaughtered to a lizard, not a man, but they were successful as Kroak unleashes this torrent of magical energy, destroying demons as he turned the tide single-handedly. But Khorne, you know, the ever-bitter ninny, sent a dozen bloodthirsters. These are the greater demons of Khorne, protected personally by the god of battle after Kroak himself. So they reached the top of the pyramid and completely tore Kroak limb from limb. And in doing so, they actually freed his spirit to unleash even more magic. It talks about how Kroak was so dedicated to the task and such conviction he wanted to destroy these demons. He's no longer bound by his mortal body now. So he fills the First City with this sort of divine light that, think of it as like banishment times 50 overcast, that banishes each and every demon present. And as before we jump over to the dwarfs, it's important to know that these skinks literally, in the days after the Great Catastrophe, they go around Lustria trying to find the pieces of Lord Kroak, and they assemble him back together, and he becomes this mummified Slann on top of a Palantir with his spirit kind of hovering over it and around it. Like he's still there. His spirit is so strong that he can reanimate his body. In the end times, he literally wills himself back to life because his spirit is so strong. He's so connected to the winds of magic and the Warhammer world. So that's kind of a really cool bit about Lord Kroak. He's a very strong caster in the game. He's a really, really cool character from a lore perspective because he's kind of like the ultimate Deus Ex Machina for the Lizardmen. In fact, in the end times, he does quite a lot of crazy stuff, and we'll go into that in some end times videos that I hope to make. But we'll delve into our moving bar stools. I mean dwarfs, and their part in the Great Catastrophe. The dwarfs were completely isolated at this time. Living in the World's Edge Mountains, they really only had interaction with the tribal races of man at this time, and no one else. This is also a time when all the ancestor gods of the dwarfs are still alive. This is considered the age of ancestors. So when the demons came, they did not find the dwarfs lacking in their defense. Grungi had taught his folk runesmithing, Valaya warded against the fell magic of the demons, and Grimnir led the valiant armies of the Dawi. Grimnir is the kind of warrior patron of the Dawi, and he destroys these demon hosts, one after the other, and eventually starts to mount counterattacks throughout the mountains. And actually, they had fought so viciously in the initial portions of the incursion that they had completely cleared the World's Edge Mountains of demons. And Grimnir then went on the offensive, him being the future patron of slayers. But eventually, Calidor Dragon Tamer, we've talked about a little bit, and his High Elf fleet were blown off course after getting this massive naval battle with the Chaos fleet on the open ocean. And they land on the old world and met Grimnir. And this is a huge point in the history here, as this is the first time elf and dwarf are aware that either one even exists. And they're not foes yet, so that's even bigger. So a large force of beastmen attacks, right as these two races meet each other, and they actually ally together to crush the beastmen. And since Calidor had come to the old world looking for evidence of a chaos gate, and corroborating Grimnir's story with what Anarion was telling him, he devised that there had to be a chaos gate in the northern chaos wastes, above where we would have the Empire. And the two sort of part ways in an amiable way. They give one another a gift, kind of setting up the eventual alliance of elf and dwarf. So we see the elves and the dwarfs meeting each other and having it be a very positive interaction, and having them come out of it not enemies. So it's important to see here. This is where that alliance kind of starts between Calidor and Grimnir, and eventually the elves and the dwarfs. But after Calidor departed, the demons returned to the World's Edge Mountains. But this time, they were prepared, not only in numbers but wild to the ways of the Dawi. They besieged all of their holds, and even though Grimnir could lead successful offensive, he could not lead them all. And one after one, holds start to fall to the demons, and this spurred Grimnir's march north towards the Chaos gates, which we've covered in our video on Grimnir itself. I don't want to repeat that whole portion of it because it's pretty epic, so I'll link that to the end of this video. Go ahead and click on that when this video ends, and you can hear the story of how Grimnir marches north with his son. But after the Great Vortex was erected, the besieging demons all vanish for the most part, along with the dwarf ancestor gods. And that's the kind of weird thing, is a lot of stuff in the Warhammer world, especially with their patron gods or their patron kings like Gilles le Breton, become sort of this anachronism for King Arthur, right? Where when his people need him the most, he will return. And that's what happens with the dwarf ancestor gods. They're thought to have, well, for the exception of Grimnir, they're thought to have rejoined into the heart of the mountain to come out when their race needs them. Dwarfs, the Dawi, the Karazankor needs them the most. Speaking of the Karazankor, this really began the rise of the Karazankor and the height of the Dwarven society as they rekindled their holds in the World's Edge Mountain. As for the Mountains of Morn, though, and they had extended at that point at this time, these never rejoined the Dwarf Empire, and this is where the Chaos Dwarfs reside, corrupted by Hashut, the evil bull god and father of darkness. And We'll go into a little bit about the Chaos Dwarfs soon here, but the Chaos Dwarfs have sorcerers, and the sorcerers are really their priest caste that rule over all of the Chaos Dwarfs. So there's no like Thane and Lord system like there is in the normal Karazhan course. That's kind of a cool thing to know. But we'll go into really just the best race ever to have ever existed. So I've saved the best for last, obviously, as this is really the button on the story as a whole, and not just my simple personal bias with the elves, but also it's about the high elves. You know, so they're the most valiant, bravest, and strongest of all the races before, currently, and yet to come. For the exception of their lack of AP missiles, but hey, they die with grace. So we've sort of loosely touched on what happens here, right? But I want to go over everything one more time, as it really bears repeating. It's very important because this sets up, again, what we know the world to be. So it all starts with Anarion, who was actually just a wanderer at the start of the Chaos Incursion. Going from place to place, he effectively traveled the entire world. So he returns to Ulthuan when the fighting really starts to get particularly fierce. His homeland is besieged by unholy and fell monstrosities, you know, all over the place. The entire nation was beset by chaos, and and I don't mean like, oh, you know, they're at the gates. No, all of Ulthuan was attacked, inner and outer kingdoms. So he has to battle his way directly to the shrine of Assyrian. And here he sort of offers himself up as a sacrifice to save his people from chaos. So he did what any sensible person asking for a request would be. Chucked himself into the flames of Assyrian. And rather than dying, he was born anew as the first Phoenix King and an incarnate of Assyrian. And this becomes a trend that all the Phoenix Kings have to follow. But just like Tyrion in the years to come, Assyrian wins his first battle at the shrine of Assyrian itself, heaving this hunting spear and slaying the demon prince that leads this charge of this massive demon horde outside the shrine. He then picked up the demon's own weapons and slaughtered the host completely. That's something out of like a Dwarf Slayer Book of Grudges right there. And it's important to note that the elves were at a pretty bleak state at this time. They weren't winning any battles and were constantly being thrown back on their own homeland. And this victory invigorated the elven people, and they immediately rallied to Anarion's banner. And up to this point, the elves weren't versed in battle or warfare at all, really. They had been farmers and simple people of the land. So this was all very new to them. And sealing the deal, Calidor Dragon Tamer also swore fealty to Anarion. So the two, like Tyrion and Teclis, trained the mighty glittering hosts of the elves, Anarion by sword, Calidor by spell. And Anarion commissioned the priests of Vol to smith weapons. And we've talked about how Vol is all about smithing and the god of the forge, almost like a Hephaestus of the Greek pantheon. And he's also creating these armor from Ithelmar and steel as Calidor starts to train the next generation of mages to help banish the demons. So finally the elves could mount an actual offensive against chaos, and most importantly, win. For 100 years the wars rage all throughout Ulthuan, and even as they fought and won, they still started losing the long war of attrition, and elves began to really lose heart here, elves being quite emotional. Calidor kind of saw the writing on the wall for this, right? And as it were, he devised a plan to work on a giant vortex that would drain the magic from the world, and thus the demon's very means of materializing in this world. Anarion resisted the plan, and even though he knew that this was the only way out, and it kind of harkens back to the intro of the High Elf campaign, with Tyrion and Teclis kind of arguing back and forth with one another. But they would have chosen Anarion's path of constant warfare had the demons not attacked Averlorn. There, they killed Astariel, the Everqueen of Ulthuan and Anarion's wife. And although not dead, Anarion assumed his children had been killed as well, and this sent him into a black rage, like just completely consumed him in anger. And he flew on the back of his mighty dragon, in Draupnir, who we've talked about, to pull the Widowmaker from the Blighted Isle at the altar of Cain. We see this in Total War Warhammer 2, and actually having an altar of Cain as a unique building choice as well. But this weapon could kill gods and men alike, and it was a curse blade, one that existed before the time of elves even. And it was said it would doom your entire lineage, and that was something that actually happens later on. The heirs of Anarion, the heirs of Anarion's line, are cursed with the curse of Anarion. They're tested for it, So it's something that actually comes to fruition. But there's this sweeping sort of historic moment or histrionic moment is probably a better word for it, where it talks about Anarion flying to the island and the elven gods whispering into his ears as he travels to tell him to turn back, turn back. And Anarion's fury is just too wild and too hot to be tamed. So he draws this sword and gets imbued with the power of Cain, the god of blood, the god of warfare, basically the elf version of Khorne. But the veterans of the war so far, the more grim and darker of the elves, flocked to Anarion's banner even more so, as he created this kind of new kingdom in the land of Nagaraith. And this is the seat of the court of Anarion that we've talked about. And this is where he took up Marathi as his second wife, who is this seeress, and they end up having Malekith, his son. So Anarion starts to become cold and cruel. The sword and his rage are slowly kind of hardening the once very noble elf, and this led to Calidor leaving his court, saying like, no, I'm not taking this. And he takes all of his dragons, which sounds very petty, very elvish, but he takes all of his dragons and settles in what is to eventually become Calidor. And Anarion just is incensed. He's furious, and before he could really lash out at Calidor for leaving, another massive demon invasion begins. An invasion so massive that it spelled pretty much utter doom for the entire elven race. Like they saw it and went, no, a foregone conclusion, we get it. But Calidor, sort of rather than consulting with Anarion, made for the Isle of the Dead to start his ritual to create the Great Vortex. He's kind of forcing Anarion's hand. So Anarion rides out to aid who is his closest friend. I mean, even though he's angry at this point, it's still like they have built the Elven Empire to what it is at this point, and he knows in the long run that Calidor is ultimately right. So here you have this epic meeting of these two massive elven hosts, and it even describes in the book that the dragons can actually like blot out the sun. There's so many of them, and when you read the Blood of Anarion book in the Whalem King Tyrion and Teclis trilogy, the very beginning, the prologue of it talks about how there's these dragons darting in and out of the conflict and just ripping things apart. But there's all manner of beasts against this unending legion of demons. And as Calidor's mages create the vortex on the Isle of the Dead, elves and demons kind of just savage each other as dragons sweep from the sky, like I was saying, just ripping each other apart. But you have this titanic finale of the conflict as Anarion and Dragnir single-handedly kill 4 demons of chaos as they try to breach Calidor's wards that were set up to protect the mages during the invocation. So this is huge, as a mortal man really cannot kill one, let alone 4 greater demons. I mean, even if I'm thinking about it from a tabletop perspective, a greater demon of Khorne's stat profile is insane when it comes to, an Electa count. Like, no thank you, it's not going to happen. Or even just an elf prince, because an elf prince has got such a terrible actual tanking capabilities that it just get beat around by the greater demon of Khorne. But the battle really took its toll, really. It gravely wounded both Dragnir and Anarion. And in that Blood of Anarion book, it talks about how a greater demon of Khorne slashes his axe into Dragnir, explodes the side of its body, sending pieces of dragon shrapnel, more or less, all over Anarion's helmet. And it's a sad part of the book, I'm not going to lie. I read it and cried my ass off, but they killed the dragon. But as the vortex was completed, the world fell silent before these bolts of energy, and we saw this right in the video here. Bolts of energy coalesced and streamed up into the sky, drawing in the winds of magic in a swirling, kind of constant moving hurricane of arcane fury. And the Slann lent their aid from across the world, sensing the creation of the massive vortex to help strengthen and empower it. And this is a direct excerpt from the High Elf Army book, and I really like the way it was worded, so I'm going to read that verbatim for you. So, his foes defeated, but his body ruined, Anarion climbed wearily upon the back of the wounded Dragnir, and made once more for the blighted isle. Barely managing to complete the journey, Dragnir crashed to the ground on the shores of that dismal island, trembling from fatigue and the terrible wounds to his ancient body, and Dragnir gave one last bellow of defiance and died. Alone, Anarion crawled back to the altar of Cain. He knew that should anyone take the weapon of Cain, it would rule the world, and so he thrust it back into the rock from whence it came. Then, it is said, he lay down beside the ravaged and torn bulk of his beloved steed, and passed from that age of the world. Very Lord of the Rings-esque ending to the greatest high elf to ever have lived. And the results of the Vortex are this series of earthquakes that really reshaped the continent of Ulthuan, but at least the polar gates were sealed, and these demonic legions are held at bay. So you have here now the creation of this Vortex, and this Vortex becomes a centerpiece for the Total Warhammer 2 campaign, and it allows for the Dwarf Empire, the Karazhan Corps, to rise strong and true. The High Elves now start to, after this point, they can now start rebuilding, and the Sundering is not far off from this point, but this allows them to expand to every portion of the New World and the Old World. This is when you get your Citadel of Dusk and Dawn being made, where the Sea Elves kind of make their home in what is eventually becomes Marienburg and the such. So you get the High Elves kind of expanding out and creating the High Elf Empire, or the Elf Empire, and the Lizardmen start to piece together everything at this point, trying to find some way to get hints to what the master plan is, the Great Plan from the Old Ones, as it's called. And they kind of always act as the behind the shadows, lawful good type people. Like, they're always doing whatever it takes to get the world moving in the direction that they think the Old Ones are moving in. But this video here, again, I just wanted to kind of illustrate the importance of the Great Catastrophe, the importance of the Great Vortex, and what each of the races play in it. You know, we don't really get a conclusive, I guess you could say conclusive readout or a conclusive idea of what happens during this time from the game. So I wanted to give you guys an ability to really understand that. So hopefully you got a pretty good idea from that here. If you have any questions about the Great Catastrophe, or you want to know more about some of the other races like the Wood Elves, which are still part of the Elves of this time, they don't really get any play in this because they're not there. The humans are pretty much kind of tribal, so they don't really matter at this point yet. There's no Sigmar. There's some Bretonnia, which are the proto-Bretonnia tribesmen. You've got Araby, who basically talks about they mention Araby and Khemri mention the Grand Chaos incursion, and they mention that these like grand spirits of the desert rose up to defeat things. So they never really played a direct hand in things. They talk about their almost like a creation story, more or less, about these desert spirits defending and destroying these demons for them. So it's very interesting little blurb from them. But if you do have any other question, guys, please feel free to comment. More than happy to answer here. Got some more goodies coming your way. Some more stuff on, I'm going to be doing a video on Valaya, as I've promised, and some more of the Tomb King's lore, but hopefully some other lore here I've got planned as well. So stay tuned. Don't forget to subscribe, and let me know if you want to hear about or know anything else. Have a good one, guys, and take care.